Hello, everyone. As we continue to endure these tumultuous times, I believe that it's important to get accurate depictions of what's currently going on as it pertains to these worldly events. And that's exactly what we're going to take a look at in today's video. I'm going to show you a quick clip of Colonel Douglas McGregor giving what I believe to be a very accurate and adequate depiction of what's currently going on the ground in Ukraine as it pertains to the Ukraine-Russian war.
He went in, that is, Mr. Putin went into eastern Ukraine with a set of assumptions that were not valid. But at the time, he thought they were. He said, we don't want to kill civilians. We don't want to destroy infrastructure. In fact, we want to wage a very limited campaign because our principal interest is in eradicating these radical elements in the East, putting an end to the hostile force that is being built up by the United States and NATO in eastern Ukraine, and come to some sort of agreement that would allow for the equal representation before the law for the rights of Russians living in Ukraine. He thought, well, we're fighting a brother Slavic country, and we don't want this to last any longer than absolutely necessary. And I think he believed that he would have a serious negotiating partner in Kiev and in Washington. He was wrong. Everything has now changed. It began changing in the summer. Decisions were made in August about how they would approach the rest of this campaign. And now we're looking at a force of almost 700,000 troops surrounding Ukraine. The large probability of offensives beginning sometime over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks, whenever the ground freezes completely and the Russians judge their force to be ready. And they will move in and they will finish off this Ukrainian state. Let's not kid ourselves. The regime in Kiev is likely to be annihilated along with the remainder of its armed forces, which over time have become more and more radicalized to the point where now these so-called Azov Nazis and their supporters are not only murdering Russians, they're murdering their own people. And as we saw recently, they actually set out to kill Polish troops that were serving in Ukrainian uniform in Ukraine. This thing is gone badly. The Russians have been running out of munitions, I guess, from day one, according to the propaganda, and the Ukrainians are still on their victory march. Well, that's all nonsense. The Russians are now fully mobilizing to complete this task. The biggest mistake we could make in the West is to involve ourselves. We've done enough damage.
Okay, hopefully you were able to digest that and take all of that in. But there's a reason why I'm showing you this video and why we're discussing this. So firstly, I want to just do a quick rundown of several statistics that I've come across, and there are many. But I'll just give you a couple to really paint this picture and bring this entire story home. So 3 out of 4 of Ukraine's remaining nuclear plants were shut down as a result of Russian strikes on key nodes of Ukraine's energy grid. You see statistics such as 80% of Kyiv, a city with the population of around 3 million or so, give or take, I believe, are without things like electricity, water, heat, etc. If you harken back to the beginning of this special military operation, as the Russian calls it, they had very specific goals, such as the demilitarization of Ukraine and what they call the denazification of Ukraine. And as we've seen in recent weeks and months, their aims or the way that they've been going about this have been changing a bit, especially in the terms of ratcheting up the offensive and really making the people on the ground in that specific area suffer as this month of the year, and things seem to be going very badly for them. But the reason why I would like to speak briefly about this, and I've shown you that clip of what's actually going on, needless to say, mainstream media aren't gonna, to them, this is still a war that is still worth fighting and sacrificing as many Ukrainian lives as possible, because it can indeed be won. And when it is won, because of course it will be won, their radical fantasizations will come to fruition, such as the dethroning of Vladimir Putin, the overthrowing of his government, and everything else that they so ardently believe in. But I think this is important to bring about and have a brief discussion on, is because while all these things are happening, And we are seeing the situation for what it is, and it isn't the nice, colorful picture that they paint us in mainstream media of David versus Goliath and David actually winning. It's a very darker situation. And it's interesting because US policy has not changed with these developments. Although we see different sentiments, although it's extremely contradicting, a person like General Mark Milley, one of the heads of the US military, of course, we've seen in the past him singing, the praises of this war, basically telling us blatantly. I may have or may not have made a video on it, telling us that this war is essentially a proxy in order to preserve U.S. hegemony and authority and everything else, as it's currently slipping, and the U.S. is flailing about trying to hold on to its former grace. But even he, most recently, has been a proponent of negotiations, which U.S. policy has not been geared towards, especially with these new developments and this induced suffering of the people of Ukraine. They have not been engaged in any negotiations. Mr. Zelensky himself knows, and many of us already know, that if he were to indeed engage in any kind of peace settlement or negotiation talks, the Nazis that are so ever prevalent in that particular part of the world would do away with him. And then there'd be a new leader, and they'd continue on with what they're currently doing, which is what we see. And it's incredible because the US government is doing all of this, basically not taking into any consideration the risks that this proposes if they do indeed decide to do something even more drastic, such as engage in this, which Mr. McGregor said that it shouldn't be done, of course, because it threatens us all. But I just thought this was incredible because when you look at what's going on the ground, the reality of it, and you look at US policy, it indeed has not changed. And it basically confirms what we have been saying for some time now, that they are extremely dedicated to fighting to the last Ukrainian in order to try to weaken Russia and their regime. However foolhardily it may seem, they're extremely dedicated to this to try to hold on to whatever hegemony or power or authority that the U.S. empire once had that's now slipping. We see it in different situations as it pertains to China. Um, of course, as it involves Taiwan, but more specifically, placing sanctions and tariffs on China, trying to slow their growth, stopping technologies from going in China, the semiconductor debacle and everything that goes along with it, trying to stop their ascent. And this to me is, in the grand scheme of things, as it pertains to Ukraine or Taiwan or whatever else, the complete destruction of Europe at the hands of the United States, getting rid of the ties that they had with Russia as it pertains to getting the cheap energy, the cheap oil, crippling their economy, trying to make them more dependent on the US, which they have essentially successfully done. And Europe themselves have signed their own death certificate as they follow the US down the path of destruction, though there are those within those respective states that are starting to question, that are starting to challenge, and that are indeed wanting to go a separate way. But all in all, this is very consistent with the development that we've been seeing. The most consistent thing I would say is indeed US policy.